A while ago, I made a video about designing fire magic sounds from scratch for Skyrim. That video was originally intended to be for other sound designers, showing my process and talking about sound in general. My intent wasn't to focus on Skyrim as a game in particular, but its modding community never ceases to amaze me since so many people seem to enjoy that video, sound designer or not. So I quickly uploaded those sounds to the Nexus and the feedback I got was great. Thank you to everyone who downloaded my sounds and used them in their game. It's incredible that something I uploaded just as an afterthought got the attention that it did. And thank you all for the kind words. I've been modding and playing Skyrim on and off since its release. And it's really nice to see that people still put so much effort and care into making mods basically for free for other people to enjoy. I've always been the people in this context and never the one creating the actual content. So this project is kind of like my contribution and my thank you to that community. Sound designer or not, I hope you'll enjoy this showcase where I'll talk about my thought process and show the building blocks of some of the sounds. The magic system in Skyrim consists of different schools of magic that have their own respective pool of spells. These spells can be used to buff, to heal, and to attack, etc. The school of magic that I will be designing for this mod is the Destruction School. These are offensive type spells, and the school consists of 3 different elements: fire, frost, and shock. They all have different properties, and they also sound different. When analyzing, the vanilla fire spell sounds very crunchy and dark. They have a very prominent low end or bass, and also mids on the frequency spectrum. These sounds are usually quite heavily distorted in those lower frequencies, with added fire crackle and burning in the highs. Together, it all sounds like this. I would say that the crunchy dark tone is what characterizes these sounds. Meanwhile, the ice spells have a much rounder low end, and the mids are also quite tame. It's got this howling wind quality to it, and on this resonance here, on the spectrum just before 800 Hz, you can clearly both see and hear the reason for why it has that quality. With both the low end and the mids quite tame, I can assume that the highs, along with the wind howl, make up much of what I consider to be the main players of these frost spells. The highs consist of this sizzling, glass-like texture. Together, they sound like this. The low end of the shock spells is also quite round. But the mids have got this crunchier, distorted feeling, and it's similar to the fire spells in that aspect, but much more hollow and less warm. The high end is also very prominent, just like the frost spells, but it sounds more erratic and jagged, not as smooth. Together it sounds like this. So, why am I showing all this? When making my sounds, I want to respect these vanilla magic sound characteristics as much as possible. My philosophy will be the same as my previous video, making sounds that I like, but still trying to stray not too far from the original ideas. I want to make my sounds fit inside the game and be lore friendly, and I also think that's more challenging and instructive for my own personal practice too. In the last video, I used only sounds that were from my own personal library and synthesis to make the sounds. It was kind of like a personal challenge to see if I could make it sound good without using really premium sounds from third-party libraries. I guess it's like an ego thing in the sound designer community, to be able to say that you made it completely from scratch. Though this time around, alongside my own recordings, I'll also be using third-party libraries and services like Soundly to design the sounds. This is a simple matter of the process otherwise being too time-consuming, and I also need time for other stuff that I'm making. I want to give a special shout out to Simon Haglund and Simon Olfsand for the opportunity of being able to record sound alongside them. This stuff is way more fun when doing it with friends and not alone. I'll start off by showing how I made one of the fire spells. These sounds have technically already been made in the previous video, but I'm cleaning them up and making them sound even better than before by layering them with third-party sounds. I wanted the fire spells to sound faster and more explosive than vanilla. Let's look at the building blocks of the explosive impact when the fireball spell hits a target. This is one of the sounds that I actually skipped making in the last video. In this case, I will start with the bass so that I will have a nice foundation to put the other sounds on top of. I found this really crunchy explosion sample that I really liked and a boomy geophone recording. Together, they sound like this. The sound is quite wide and I want to narrow it down because I want it to be focused to a single point when it hits. This is so that it will be like a guide and be clear to the player where the impact is. Because remember, sound design is not only supposed to sound cool, but it's also supposed to be helpful and like guide the listener. So I don't want the sound to be all over the place in the stereo spectrum. A stereo plugin with the width set to 0 will fix that. Then I'm adding some additional distortion with Decapitator and turning the tone knob to dark for that dark crunch. I'm also shortening the tail by automating a gain knob. With these effects, it sounds like this. On top of this, I want a short initial hit. I want it to sound beefy. This is a sample of a fire burst sound. I shorten it, and to beef it up, I'm adding a plugin called Submarine, which I really like when I want to amplify those sub-frequencies. I'm cutting the high end a bit with an EQ, and also narrowing the sound to mono like I did with the low end group. Now the sound is big, but I want it to be a bit more distorted, and it's also clipping a bit. So I killed 2 birds with 1 stone by adding a clipper. The clipper stops the sound from clipping, with the added bonus of introducing some nice distortion when it clips. Much better. When played alongside the low end, it kinda turns into like a double transient, aka 2 impacts after another. I think it gives the sound a more unstable and volatile character. Now I want some actual fire elements. I'm using the tail of the old Firestorm spell that I made in the previous video that I'm cutting the low end from. I layer it with 2 sizzling firebursts or whooshes. I also found this really cool sound of what sounds like fire evaporating or dying down. Together with what I already have shown you, it sounds like this. At this point, what I think is still missing is an actual sound of an explosion. So I add that and remove the bass. I think now it sounds really cool. On the parent track, I add Shep's parallel particles to beef the sound even further, and another clipper to keep the sound from clipping. When leaving the sub-project, I actually worked even more on the sound. I wanted the sound to have a bit more tail, so I put some reverb, Pro-R, on a send. Then I compressed the sound even more with the C4 multiband compressor and a really aggressive OTT that I automated away over time. This brought out some of the details in the fire element layers. Last but not least, I tried a function called EQ match inside ProQ and used the vanilla impact as a reference. It worked surprisingly well in this case, and I struggled my way through the voices of the sound designers in my head, telling me that I suck and that I should just use my ears to balance it instead, and that I learn way more from doing that. But,
ain't nobody got time for that!
I'm really happy with the end result, and I think that's what matters. When making frost spells, I felt like I wanted to introduce more crunch than in the vanilla versions. I always felt like I wanted more weight in the sound when I shot a spear of ice from my palms. So on the frost spike spell, the crunch is exactly what I started with, and I make it mono right off the bat because I want this sound to be like a ground pillar. I pitched it down 3 semitones because I wanted it to be slightly darker. I then added the extremely over-the-top OTT module that I used before to bring out the details. I cut the low mids quite substantially and added a slight low-pass filter. I also added a clipper for good measure. It barely clips anything, and I know I'm overusing it, but it's like a little snuff blanket for me. It's not an instantly bad thing that your sound clips a little bit. I mean, literally all of the main like vanilla spell sounds clip like 1 or 1.5 decibels. I think for me it's more of a visual thing. I then add more crunchy, freezy sounds, and these have more high-end sparkle and more detail, and they're more stereo, since the Vanilla Ice sound seems to have a much more loose perspective on the stereo image. They're wider than the other spell types. I then add a glass shatter impact sound and sidechain compress it with the main crunch sound as the signal. Now it kind of sounds like an icy spear materializing, and it sounds good, but I need to add more of a magical quality to it. I create a simple noise swoosh patch in Faceplant and drive it through some filter modulation for a more phasey sound. I then consolidate the sound, duplicate it, and pan them left and right respectively. I also make sure that they start playing at slightly different timings for a cool stereo effect. I add this plugin that makes it sound a bit more hi-fi and cut the bass because I don't want to have too much gunk fighting in the low end. It's quite subtle when played alongside the other sounds. I then add some glittery sounds, some howling wind and some whooshes that are a bit darker. At this point, I'm quite happy with the sound and run it through a reverb send to glue everything together. It's a matter of taste what reverb you think fits. I used Little Plate from Sound Toys because I want a bit of that metallic feeling. In the master chain, I basically compress it with a multiband compressor and a creative compressor. I tweak the punchiness of the transient, tweak the stereo image, and add submarine for more sub. I also correct it slightly with an EQ and finish with a clipper. After that, I utilize the match EQ function, once again, with the vanilla sounds as a reference. I tweak the stereo image even more and lower the bass a bit. There's no specific reason for using this particular EQ. I just grabbed the first tool that I found and it happened to be this one. I know this one probably does more things than just like a standard 3-band EQ, but hey, don't focus on that. Just know it sounds pretty good and still true to the original. And yeah, I also added these crunchy sounds to the impact decals. Moving on to the shock spells, I want to bump up the aggressiveness of these and make it sound more confident. Before showing you how I did the Sparks spell, I feel like I need to shout out Polarity, a sound effect by Matti Aselotto that contains all sorts of electricity samples. This library has been used extensively on these shock spells, and well, you can outright hear some of them, especially in the looping portion of the sound I'm about to show you. If it sounds good, don't fix it. And boy do these sound good. Starting off with the low end, I made this wavetable sub-drop in Faceplant and reversed it. I then added it to the portion where the loop ends. At the start, I added a kick sample. I then added this continuous beam of electricity, so to speak, from Polarity. With the low end created, I also wanted to add like a short click in the beginning for a, you guessed it, double transient. This is also a sample from Polarity that I cut down really short, and it may be really short, but it does a lot for the sound, I think. I then added this phasey sound to the beginning and the end of the loop. I also added a ton of different zaps and sparks and sizzles. One of the more useful sounds from Polarity, or at least the one I've used a lot, is this sound of, I think it's like really hot water evaporating. The sizzle is so satisfying, and I put it at the end of this sound. I also added some thunder in the end. In the final touch-ups, I added a C4 multiband compressor, some correction EQ, and a soothe module that removes a lot of the harshness. I feel like the sound of electricity is harsh by nature, and if you're gonna listen to this sound over and over again when playing as a mage or whatever, It's gotta be a little bit nicer to the ears. When exporting a sound that's supposed to have a looping part in the middle, for the engine playing the sound in Skyrim to understand this, you've gotta embed these regions in the export section in Reaper. When done correctly, your exported WAV file will have 2 lines, like this. And that's it. Even though this mod has got the word enhanced in the title, it seems like a popular keyword on the Nexus, along the likes of overhaul. I don't actually see it as a replacement that's better than the vanilla sounds in any way. It's more like an alternative if you want some change in the overall feel of using spells in your next playthrough. Thank you guys for watching. Here's the sound comparison, vanilla versus modded.